Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'd like to welcome everyone to this special called meeting and joint workshop of the Danville City Commission and the Danville Architectural Heritage Board. For this Tuesday, March the 3rd, the hour is 9:35. And I will call us to order. Commissioner Terry is with the flu.
Yes.
So that she will not be joining us, and we're thankful that she will not be joining us.
Amen.
Our order of business today is discussion of section 6.3.3, public art from the Historic Overlay District Design Guidelines. Before I turn this over to Joni House, let me ask council and/or city manager if they have any comments or instructions before we begin.
Mr. Mayor, we actually have staff representative that will be guiding you through the process with an introduction today. This is a work session, so this is an opportunity to go through the particular section. You have a handout, and staff will be walking you through that. There are a couple issues that, or big questions, if you will, that need to be addressed. But more importantly, this is to make sure that hopefully by the end of the work session that we have a cohesive understanding of public art so that the process works as it should without hiccups and hopefully without further controversial appeals.
That's a lofty goal when it comes to talking about art. With that said, thank you very much for that.
Mr. Mayor, can I make a comment before we get started as well?
Certainly, sir.
I know we have a new city manager, but if this is a work session, I really not feel comfortable about the setup of the room. I think we need to have a more inclusive setup, and that is to get us out around tables with folks who are doing this work and have a more succinct discussion. This looks as if it's somebody sitting high and looking low, and I don't have the authority to do any of that. So.
We can adjust that easily enough.
Good.
Ms. House, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'll let everybody get settled. And this is genuinely going to be a working session. We have put this off for a while, trying to get our ducks in a row, and now is the time, folks, to proceed with this. So basically, I wanted to give you a rundown of how I'm going to run this so that we don't get off base or have questions that we need to address now that might actually come up later. So we're going to go through this pretty quickly. I'm just going to do a brief introduction to it and set it up how it's structured for you. Then we'll go back and revisit the questions that we need to talk about in those issues. So if you do have something you need to ask me, please feel free to stop. I'll discuss it, but we're going to get into more in depth as we come back to them. That way we can handle these one at a time because some of them are big questions. There are some things on here that you're going to see, the shall nots. Those are the best practices recommended to us by the National Park Service and the Kentucky Heritage Council. So those are kind of things that are there that are not really on the table for discussion. These are the things that we really have to do to maintain our certified local government and our historic district overlay. And they're pretty basic, and I don't think any of those are really controversial at all. Then we're going to come back, and as I said, each question we're going to have some board discussion and address what we're doing and get feedback and take it from there. All right, so what does the Danville Architectural Heritage Board actually do? I wanted to make sure that everyone realized that it is their job to minimize the potential for negative impacts to the historic overlay district while concurrently allowing for active practical use for our heritage places in a way that sustains them as economic and cultural assets. That is the job of the DAHB when they make rulings on the COAs.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Has the board agreed to that statement?
It is in the design guidelines.
Okay.
So it has been agreed upon.
Thank you.
That is published in the design guidelines, Mayor.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we can start this out with the big question. Do we want public art in the historic overlay district? That's a simple yes or no. And I believe the answer would be yes to that. So you guys tell me, is this what you want to do here? Before we even get started?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Now that's out of the way.
I
We
think
know
that's why we're here. If it's a
that's why
no,
we're
we're
here.
dismissed.
Well, we need to ask that question because everything that we do is predicated on that. Very simple question, do we want it or not? And yes, we obviously do. So our goal for this eventually is to restructure 6.33. That is the Certified Local Government's #1 goal for 2020 is to redo those particular guidelines that deal with public art in the Historic Overlay District. They're published in the guidelines now, and as we move through this process, we will have to move those into a published form that we can post to the public and that we will follow and both boards will follow as we move through this. This has been requested by the public, both boards and commissions, and it is, as I said, our #1 goal. So here's the process that we would like to do. And I met with Stephen some weeks ago, and he suggested that we have a process, and we were all kind of floundering around, so I think that this is probably the best thing and the best way to work it. We're going to complete this workshop. We're going to give you 2 weeks for feedback and comments. So if there's a big question that you need more research on, need to talk more about, we're going to have some time to do that. I will then produce a first draft of the 6.33 guidelines. We present that for public comment, present that back to you, and then we will move on to the finalized document. Now, we have to submit these to the Kentucky Heritage Council. They have to be submitted to them for their approvals because they are dealing with the Certified Local Government Design Guidelines. So we need to get their blessing on this. Then we will give them to the Danville Architectural Heritage Board, who will have a public hearing, moves to planning and zoning with a public hearing, and then finally to the City Commission. And that is the process that we're going to follow. Now, what does DAHB actually review? Per the guidelines now set in all of the published briefs from the National Park Service, we need to look at location, application, material size, and maintenance. The big talk about content and what it is the design content, DAHB does not need to rule on that. It is from the city commission or from the city attorney when we met that really it is not appropriate for DAHB to talk about design in the content. And it is also recommended through the National Park Service and through the Kentucky Heritage Council that we look at these 5 things and not design. And I'll happily talk about that as we get further into this, and if you have questions about that, we can certainly answer that. So basically, what are we looking at? Location. Where do we place public art on structures? Now, here are the shall nots. Murals are not appropriate for the front facades of any building in the Historic Overlay District. I think that's been determined. Nobody's applied for one, and that seems to be the universal practice. Art locations must not obscure, alter, or cause damage to a structure's character, defining features. That very simply means that someone cannot go and take over windows off a building to put a piece of art on, or someone cannot cut out a historic doorway to make it a piece of art. You cannot change the structure's actual structure. Art cannot impair the ability to interpret the historic character of a structure or overall district. Very simple definition of that. If someone wants to put a 40-foot standing tidal wave crashing into a building, and it completely obscures what the building looks like. It completely causes the flow, the step backs and everything of the district to change. That is not appropriate. That is not really a design question. It is just not appropriate because it's obscuring what the structure actually looks like.
Quick question.
Yes, certainly, absolutely.
And this is probably a silly question, but I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Yes, sir.
It says in the first shall not, not appropriate for front facades.
Correct.
It's plural, so are we talking about anything you can see from the frontage
No,
street?
only the
or
front
just the
facades of the buildings.
Just the front
Yes.
face
Yes, sir.
of the building?
Mhm. What is on the street, on the
Okay.
streetway.
Okay,
Like
just-
if you're walking down Main Street, just the fronts of the building, that's what we're specifically referring to.
Okay, I just want to
Side
be sure.
facades and back facades often are seen from the public right away, but it is only on the front facades.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, I think you're saying the plural is relating to the various buildings, not multiple facades for one particular structure.
Correct. Thank you. Now we get into the questions and discussions. I have spent a lot of time talking with folks about what they think is appropriate, what they don't think is appropriate, and again, we're going to come back to this. But we have some questions to answer and some discussion. Do we want to allow art on only non-contributing structures, or do we want to allow them on contributing structures? Now, the definitions are there for contributing property and non-contributing property. They're in your packets. I don't feel like I need to read them to you guys. It's pretty clear what they are. This is a big question. Do we want to allow them on those contributing or non-contributing structures? That we're going to come back to. Application, these are the shall nots. You cannot paint on unpainted masonry. You don't paint on unpainted masonry in any historic district. Anything mounted on masonry structures must adhere to the proper fastening guidelines set forth by the Secretary of the Interior Standards. Basically, that means if you're putting something on a masonry building, that you should anchor it through the mortar joints and not drill through the masonry. That's standard practical guidelines, and we've never had any issue with that. Adhesive films can only go on the window glass. If you start sticking adhesive films onto masonry buildings, it could cause a problem. So we don't want to see any adhesive films put on actual masonry itself. So the question to answer here, how do we want it to be applied to the building? Do we want to allow painting directly on the building? Do we want to make sure that the murals are on a substrate material and then correctly anchored to the building? That is the big question there. Do we want to allow people to paint directly on buildings, or do they need to be required, as in some cities, to put them on something that's removable? Materials. What are we actually applying to the structure? These are the shall nots. You cannot put reflective or luminescent paints. They're just not appropriate. That means that there's a life safety issue, and I don't think anyone wants to see a reflective anything on the main street. Anything mounted on masonry must adhere to the proper fastening guidelines set forth by the Secretary of the Interior Standards. Again, adhesive films may not be mounted on any structure other than windows. Now, these are the best practices. What is the material that we want to apply to these buildings? Well, we obviously want high-quality material. Exterior grade paints are required. Most historic districts are now requiring any public art have anti-graffiti coating or other sealants put on it. And the reason being is exceedingly expensive to remove any of that. And if you have to be liable for that on your building, it's going to be quite expensive. So most historic districts are requiring that now, which is something that we can do. Now, here's the big question. What size is appropriate for a mural in Danville? There's a couple questions here. Firstly, do we want to even, and I've heard this, and I believe that that's a legitimate question, is do we want to review it if it's not visible from the public right away? And then again, there is do we want to treat it like a sign? I have the definition of the sign from the zoning ordinance this morning, and Steve's around to talk about that today if you all have specific questions about that. But we will talk about what the actual definition of the sign is. We also have some set sign sizes for the downtown commercial districts. It's either 5% or 10% of the facade if we look at it as a sign. If we don't choose to treat it that way, then what size is appropriate? And if we do set a standard, are we only going to allow one mural per structure? We don't want to get into a situation where we have 5 small murals on a structure. And then there's the maintenance issue. How do we want to take care of our public art? First and foremost, the property owner is responsible for property maintenance of the mural, including all repairs. Fading, peeling, or material failure must be corrected and in compliance with all city ordinances. Most of our murals we permit for 5 years. And then we have got into a situation in several areas in the United States where there's some issues about murals being applied to buildings and who has the legal right to them and who can take pictures of them, make money off them when they can be removed. So it is a good idea for the artist and the building owner to have some type of general lease for the city in case we make them go and paint over a mural that is failing. So that is something for you to think about. Now, at this point, I'm happy to take any general questions that you have. If not, we'll get, as they say, into the nitty-gritty of the situation.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'd say certainly you guys, you have any questions? I mean, don't feel like you're excluded. As J.H. said, we seem to be elevated here, and I don't like it that much either, but this is a workshop, so.
No, if it gets vandalized, If you have, if you go into Louisville now, there's several statues that have got paint all over them, and it's getting up into the $20,000 range to remove those from statues. So that's what I'm specifically speaking about.
I just wonder if we're only allowing 5 years, if we're only allowing 5 years, a lifespan on a mural, sort of minimum, wouldn't anti-graffiti measures make it really difficult to repaint or, restore that surface to its original?
That is a question worth asking, and I'm not sure what the specific application would be.
Yeah.
But I think we probably talk about that when we get there.
Okay. As a mural artist, I've researched that a little bit, and some muralists even say that, not to put a sealant on it, just because if there were to be any moisture in the walls, that creates sort of a barrier that does not let the moisture escape, and that comes at the cost of the surface and the mural's integrity itself, in terms of blistering and bubbling and that sort of thing.
Can I make a request? This is being recorded. Can you all speak? Give your name.
Oh, this is Brandon Long.
Yes, ma'am.
You got a microphone over there.
I think that not only do we need to be concerned about the artist and the property owner.
Hey, Dana, can you, yeah, there you go.
You're on. You're on.
How about that?
How about that?
Okay, sorry. Where was I? In the list of things about the artist and building owner coming to an agreement about ownership and rights, I would think that included in that should be the sponsoring agency, such as the Sister Cities Commission, or whoever came up with the money that paid the artist. They might have an ownership issue too.
Yes, ma'am, I agree. We've got a lot to work through.
My idea on that issue was simply having all parties involved, and Ms. Dixon, I think you're right, sponsor included, having all parties involved with the process sign a complete release and waiver, disclaiming ownership and rights. The only other way to get around that would be to have an actual easement on the structure, because what we would not want to get into is having a mural in disrepair and the city take corrective measure and then have be slapped with a suit for stealing intellectual property or things of that nature. So in order for the city to have its ducks in a row and to feel comfortable proceeding, all parties would need to sign a release acknowledging that the city is subject to the city's code enforcement. And actually, subject or subsequent owners may feel differently about what's on the structure itself. So I think there needs to be a reiteration through this release and waiver that it is very temporary and can change not only for lack of upkeep on behalf of the city through code enforcement, but potentially through code enforcement or subsequent ownership.
Any other questions? Okay, let's dive into it. Location. Now, the main question here is, we cannot put them on the front facades of buildings, so obviously they are allowed on the side and rear per our design guidelines. I don't think that there's any issue about putting anything on the building that might obscure the building or the structure. We've never had that issue. Some people have talked with me about allowing them on contributing buildings versus non-contributing buildings, or structures. We need to say structures because it may be a blank masonry wall somewhere within the historic district. Believe it or not, sometimes those masonry walls can be contributing structures depending on when they were put up, how old they are, what they're made of, if they have any historical significance to one of the more historic homes here in the district. So currently, we have got a grant to start surveying a lot of the contributing and non-contributing districts in the Lexington Broadway area. I believe we will get that grant. We've applied for it, and I'm pretty sure we'll get it. So we can start to answer these questions. What is contributing? What is non-contributing? We certainly treat these different as we look at the rest of the DAHB process, whether there's windows or doors that need to be moved around. We treat those differently. So it stands to reason that we would ask the question, do we want to treat art the same way? Do we want to say that art can only be on non-contributing structures, or are they allowed on contributing structures? And that is the basic question for you all to discuss and then to try to answer. So I will open the floor to discussion, and I'm happy to take any comments or.
Oh, you mean now?
Yes, I
Okay.
mean now. Yes, folks, we desperately need to get this
So,
dealt
so
with.
getting started, some of the murals we already have are on contributing structures, so we already have that going. And certainly, we've agreed to that, so right now, as I said, I think we stay with that.
Bridget, do you have the microphone? Mimi's back there.
Oh, I'm pretty loud.
Now, if you'd introduce yourself.
Okay, oh, for the recording, sorry. My name is Mimi Becker. Can you give me a definition or an example of what a non-contributing building, site, structure, or object might be? Is there, like, in an actual physical thing that you could say, this would be a non-contributing building in the historic overlay?
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
Where Searcy used to be, I think it's your old building. What is the name of that building? That is a non-contributing structure, I know that, because it's been altered. I believe the Whitaker Bank building is a non-contributing structure, is that right? They've been altered to the point that they've lost their historic integrity, so they are not contributing to the historic integrity of the district.
And
Those two
who
come to
makes,
mind.
I'm sorry, how is that documented?
That's made by the Heritage Council and National Park Service.
Okay.
It's not a local decision.
No, it is not. It is completely not a local decision. They have to meet certain benchmarks within the criteria that the National Park Service puts out. So it's not subjective. It is very regimented how they make that decision.
So that kind of thing is known from the get-go. If you say, I want to put something on this building, then you would, if you go through whatever process you all end up with, then that would be told at the beginning of the process.
Generally, yes.
Okay.
I would not be surprised when we resurvey the Central Business District if the Gilcher Hotel is deemed a non-contributing structure.
Right.
Because everything's gone but the facade.
Right.
So I would expect that would become a non-contributing. So that gives you a feel for what can happen to a building that takes it from contributing to non.
Yes, I mean, things change, and within these districts, there's been surveys done back in the 80s. I think we're going to see some changes as we resurvey these buildings. But the intent is for a database to be kept, so if someone looks at a project, we can pull that building up right off the bat and say that's a non-contributing building, or that's a contributing building. We need to know that regardless because of different treatments that the Architectural Heritage Board looks at, not just with public art, but with different things. So, yes, ma'am, that's known right at the get-go. That's important to know.
If I may, from the city manager standpoint, this is a question that comes up often. Folks will come into a community, they'll buy a property, and they don't know what is conforming, not conforming. And the fact of having non-conforming in historic versus regular are two different things. For instance, in the planning and zoning world, if I build a structure that's currently in full conformance of planning and zoning and other code regulations, it's a conforming building. But at some point, if that structure then gets altered, it's no longer conforming. In the historic side, at the time that you applied guidelines, those buildings had sort of a T-test applied to it for criteria. And if those buildings over time have gone through drastic changes and they don't meet the criteria, they're no longer conforming historic buildings. What I've seen in communities is really a list that gave address by address, and I've seen every myriad of approach, everything to, are you a class 1, class 2, class 3 building, depending on criteria of how much changes have occurred, all the way down to here is a dress, and it lists every single contributing building to the historic district, which means that is a valid building, registered, and on a list for the conforming. at the end of the day, I'll tell you that Washington's not going to swoop in and look at a specific building. But you can lose and have that challenge. You can lose your status, you can lose your grantability, your sort of historic fabric, as we like to call it in this community. So what you really have to do is, for the benefit of the public, identify every single building that is a true historic contributing, so that everybody knows from the get-go that this building has certain steps on it and has to follow certain guidelines. Then you have those buildings that are in the district that are in an overlay that then have additional guidelines or criteria that they're amenable to because they're potentially in an overlay or specific district. So I'm hoping that adds a little clarification, but also helps further the discussion for the understanding of the lay public.
I just want to say something on the back end of that real quick too, and the city manager's right, but I think it's interesting to note from the Planning Commission, and Joni just said it, that's a top priority, and to map that, make a listing is what we need. A map would be helpful too by address. But we talked about some, what I'd call maybe historic buildings, but what's funny is the district came later. And as we book in our downtown, it's easy to define some non-contributing: Domino's, post office, gas station, Speedway, Baskin-Robbins. I mean, we got tons of non-contributing buildings, and bike shop right next door, basic block wall building. That's what's interesting, I think, is looking at contributing and non-contributing. It actually opens up an opportunity if the commission decided to only allow murals on non-contributing. It may actually help some of these entrances into downtown where we clearly got non-contributing buildings that could be disguised in some way with public art, as opposed to looking the side of a Speedway or the backside of a Domino's building, dollar store that's downtown. A lot of towns only allow murals on non-contributing buildings, not contributing, because they have so many literally walls in their downtown that need some attention. And we have tons of non-contributing buildings. If you really start to think about it, even the bank building, several.
I'd like to, this is Mary Gerrard, and I'd like to say that my honest to goodness druthers are to not make a difference between contributing and non-contributing. And I say that because a lot of our contributing buildings face Main Street. They're not going to have any murals on the front side. And honestly, the back sides are ugly, and a little art could do some good there. And as the commissioner pointed out, we've been doing it before. I'm happy to grandfather things in. But in this case, I think it would behoove us, because of the makeup of the historic district, to have it on both.
I would concur with Mary on that point.
So would I.
And I was just going to add a comment. This is Kate Snyder. Just thinking, Stephen's making a point that sort of looking at public art as essentially temporary and factoring that into how concerned you are about which building it goes on, that there is a difference between a mural that you're permitting for 5 years and carving out the structure of a building that you essentially can never put back exactly the way it was, at least not without great difficulty. And thank you. My other question was going to be just how many are we talking about downtown in terms of contributing versus non-contributing? Of the murals that are up, like Bunny Davis, the Diversity, the Derby Shop mural, the Arts Center mural, how many of those are on contributing buildings? I have no idea.
Possibly 2.
I was just trying to figure out with Tom and I if John Kaywood's building is contributing or not. I'm not sure.
That is part of the new survey to decide. It may well be contributing.
I'm just not sure.
But as it stands right now, I think possibly 2 are on con. And the reason these questions come up, it is not because I'm trying to guide you all in one way or the other. It is because it is questions that have been approached to me, and it is the way other historic districts are dealing with some of this. So I'm kind of putting it out there for you all to have that discussion so that you have a wide ability to draft what Danville wants, given that we're kind of looking at what other historic overlay districts do as well. So I'm not sure.
On this point too, it's just one two quick comments. One, a non-contributing structure can very well become contributing at some point as well.
Correct.
For instance, my law office was a brick box that my partners in the 70s put ornate finishings on. Well, it's very likely contributing now.
I would say so.
Even though it wasn't original to the structure. So that's one point. The second thing is we've designed these questions in kind of a flow chart manner to help give staff clear direction on how to draft an initial set of revisions that will have ample time for public comment and dissemination in the community. And so I think this question, for the sake of moving us along, has been asked and answered.
Yes.
Just based on the consensus of the comments made. So I would say, let's proceed.
That's what I was going to ask
Okay.
you. How do we need to proceed with
I
this?
think you make a note that it seems that the tenor of the parties are that murals should be allowed on both contributing and non-contributing structures downtown due to their temporary nature, and proceed with the next question.
Works for me.
I'd like to know how the board feels about that.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let me find my complete slide here. All right, application. All right, the next is application. This one gets into some sticky wickets. How do we want this thing applied to the building? There are your shall nots, and we've all come to, I think, a consensus about what you should not do to the buildings. But the big question is, do we want to allow them to paint onto the structure? Does it need to be put on some type of material and then applied to the structure? A lot of cities require, several surrounding communities actually require that they're put onto plywood and then anchored onto the building. That way they're easily removable. If there is some issue with intellectual properties, they can certainly come down and be moved or go with the artist. And then other communities allow you to paint directly onto the structure, and Danville has done that in the past. So the question now is, do we want to continue doing that? Or would we like to see that put on some type of structure, plywood or masonry board or something, art board, and applied to the building?
It can also, this is Dana Dixon. There are other options as well, and some communities are moving to, I guess it would be a plastic film of some sort, which is then painted with inkjet according to the artist's design, and any technique can be replicated and look like paint or any kind of graphics. And that would kind of protect the building and the artist who decided they wanted it back. They could roll it up and take it home.
Joni?
Yes, sir.
This is Tom Ty, but aren't two of our works currently on a substrate that were attached to the building?
Yes.
I know the bunny mural is
Yes, it is.
canvas or something, and the plywood,
Yes, it's plywood.
and the Elmwood Inn, that's on parachute silk, I believe,
That's
isn't it?
correct. So you have some that they're painted directly onto the
And
structure.
just my thoughts are, that almost, if we use a substrate, answers a lot of the other questions. Who owns it? Well, if you own it, then you want to detach it and take it with you. It's pretty portable.
I would defer to the city attorney on that, but
I think that's true. I mean, the current guidelines say it's recommended now that they be on a separate piece of material that can be adhered to the structure in some manner. It does make enforcement quite easier. It reinforces the temporary nature, I think, which is why it's probably in there. And also, it makes code enforcement and the intellectual property issues nearly resolved if they can be taken off with, a drill as opposed to having to paint over them or touch something up. I think that is most likely preferable based upon some of these other issues. However, I know that there have been other times where murals that have been presented have said, well, it's not feasible. I don't remember all those details, but I just remember that conversation in various instances. But you know, I think the ultimate policy question is for you. It may not be feasible in every situation, and that may be okay, ultimately. If it's not feasible to put it on a temporary mechanism that you can take on and off the building, then maybe it's not appropriate. I don't know. I'm just posing the question that needs to be, you know, thought out.
This is Brandon Long again. Where most murals are created by the artist to be sort of a site-specific installation, to where you've created this artwork to be reflective of what's around it, and you've considered all the surroundings in creating the mural. It doesn't really serve the same purpose as, you know, just taking it down and I'll just take it home, because the whole context of the mural has changed at that point. When we're considering substrates too, you also have to consider that really increases the cost of the mural to provide essential substrates, considering that, you know, if you were to go with, you know, more of a standard kind of thing, if you go to Lowe's, you can buy 4x8 sheet pieces of plywood, or, you know, marine plywood for outdoor use. That really limits your size in terms of what you can pull off and have looking nice. Also, I'm not sure if the durability is as long on those.
This is Kate too. And the other comment, and I'm not positive on this, but I would really want to check, and we mentioned the diversity mural as an example of something that used a substrate, and it did, but I think it would be a mistake to think that you could just roll that up and take it somewhere else. The way that it was, I mean, it was basically wallpapered to the wall of that building. So it's not like you could just take it down, roll it into a tube, and go install it on another building. You would just, I'm fairly confident you would damage, if not destroy, the work to take it down. And that may be something that you're comfortable with, but I guess I just don't want us to think of that as like, oh, easy solution, just do it on that parachute cloth and take and roll it down.
I don't think the concern is maintenance or preservation of the artwork. The concern is preservation of the structure it's adhered to. So that's the difference. I don't think it would be a goal of the bodies before us to say, well, we want to make sure we can take it down and move it or preserve it in a manner. I think the thing is what keeps the structure of the building safe and aid in code enforcement and some of these other intellectual issues.
Just making that priority clear that we're not thinking we're protecting the artists through this, we're protecting the building.
That would be correct. Okay. That would be the priorities of these bodies, yes.
This is Mimi Becker. So are we defining public art as only that which is applied to a building?
No.
So is this argument then something that needs to be extended to structures, like, you know, statues? I mean, where is that falling in this discussion?
Currently, the design guidelines for public art, freestanding public art, are pretty secure, and they're in 6.33. They have never really come under challenge with the COAs that we've had right now.
Okay.
Basically, the only thing that's been challenged are the painted murals on the building. So it was not my intention to change any of the design guidelines specifically dealing with public art as freestanding structures.
Okay. Or there was a distinction previously between temporary and permanent.
Yes. I think if you put a bronze statue up, it's pretty permanent.
No, I'm talking about murals, because I think that was there not a distinction between what was going to be a temporary mural? Is that what you're calling 5 years? Or
Yes. Basically, in Danville, we've permitted them all as 5 years, so that, as a definition, makes them temporary murals.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So you've really kind of eliminated the concept of a permanent mural.
It's not that we have eliminated it, that is just that has been the practice for 5
Okay.
years. And we'll talk about that more as the maintenance issues come up. If we need to address that, we certainly can
Okay.
within that.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ms. Dixon.
I was just going to say that I watched a webinar yesterday which explained the federal law, which is called the Visual Artists' Rights Act. And so artists are protected. I don't think we have to worry about them. A group in Queens or Brooklyn won like $6 million because a developer decided to change his mind about the use of his building. So I think we have, not that anyone would bring such a suit in our city, but that is federal law, so that is taken care of.
My question, just because I don't have much experience or knowledge in this, and folks on the board can probably help me, is what the downside of painting directly onto the brick if it's, we don't allow it if it hasn't been painted yet. So if brick's already been painted once, what's the problem with painting over that again?
Well, from the standpoint of the city, paint peels, and so if you've got somebody who's not taking care of their mural the way they're supposed to, then the city would go in and honestly paint over it, get a nice smooth surface. Whereas if the mural is on a different sheet, something has happened, it's been torn, graffiti, whatever, then you just take that off. And so maintenance down the line is a lot easier.
So if I may chime in, and Joni certainly back me up here. So when you're looking at specifically historic masonry buildings, that material is designed to breathe. So when you paint and you seal brick, you actually damage the actual historic structure and cause extensive damage. So the National Park Service guidelines for that reason is why they say no painting of existing. Then they give you extensive guidelines for existing buildings that are painted and how to maintain them and how to resolve them if they are painted. So, and historic buildings have gotten painted, and you start to have water seepage and other issues, mold. There's a whole laundry list, but I'll leave that to the experts rather than a city manager to ponder.
And the reason I ask, I don't know how many, but I can say a good portion of the buildings along Main, the front facades anyway, is painted. So I didn't know what the issue might be if you painted the other sides of it or not. So I was just trying to get that straight.
And basically, Commissioner Connor, we don't allow painting on buildings on masonry that has never been painted.
Right.
That is one of the you
Right.
cannot do's. So basically, what we're looking at is the maintenance of the
Okay.
particular piece
So
of work.
it's pretty much a maintenance issue.
It's a maintenance issue, and it also gets into some of the intellectual property rights and how to best deal with that,
Okay.
which is a pretty weedy patch, honestly. So if you paint a mural on a building that's already painted, is it going to cause damage to that building? Most likely not. If it's already been painted, if there's going to be damage, it's already been done. So hope that answered your question.
It does. Thank you very
Okay.
much. Appreciate it.
One other thing, we're still young in the lifespan of some of the murals that we have in town. But if we try to fast forward and look in 6 years, let's say, if someone wanted to keep a mural that is in place now, they would have to reapply.
Correct.
Certainly. But let's say in the event it's beyond disrepair, the building's changed hands or what have you, and it becomes a code enforcement issue. Let's just envision that for a moment. It would require, if not voluntarily resolved by the property owner, it would require the city to abate the issue, meaning probably paint over it or whatever. We're often left in policy-making decisions to think, well, how can we limit the amount of negative touches we have with the community from a code enforcement standpoint or whatever issue? That could be a terribly negative touch with the community, depending on how people felt about a particular mural. If you have code enforcement staff or public works, slapping up paint on the side of a structure in your historic district. I just want us to visualize that a little bit, to think about. In the event things go south, which is what my job is here to think about and plan for, what does that look like? And does it look like code enforcement taking a drill and zipping out a few nails or screws, or does it look like 10 temporary summer help workers slapping up paint? Just again, I'm asking the question, not providing the answer, just because I think it's something we've not had to deal with yet. The end of the lifespan of a mural, all of them to this point have been maintained. They're still early on, but it's conceivable and probable that at some point that won't be the case. And so what should that look like? I think that should help you back into this question. And if you ultimately decide paint, then, and you say if it's worth that hassle, then so be it. But if it's not, I think it's time to consider that now.
While you deal with the back end of the issue, what if we dealt with it at the front end and made it so that if you are a building owner and you agree to have a mural painted, it becomes your responsibility, as well as the artist's responsibility, as well as the city's responsibility, to make sure within a 5-year period of time it stays up in repair. If after 5 years the painting is looking tired, then again, if we address this at the beginning and say to the building owner, hey, if you're going to do this, you're accepting responsibility for what this looks like after 5 years or even during the 5 years. Because that to me would eliminate a lot of the concern. But I have a struggle with the city coming in and painting somebody's building because of that disrepair. I think you've got to address that and make it a responsibility of not only the artist but the building owner. And how you do that in terms of some kind of covenant in the case of a change of hands, I think you can address that by saying, okay, it's part of the covenant, part of the purchase of the building. You're in year 3 of a 5-year obligation. And after 2 more years, if you decide you want to go back with a new mural and apply, or you want to refresh the mural that's there and apply, or you want to just scrap it and paint it over.
Well, currently within the COA process, there is a place for the owner to sign, the owner of the building, who accepts the responsibility of that going on his building. So that is right off the bat agreed to on the COA, that the owner knows that this is his responsibility or her responsibility to take care of. I'm not sure that that's a covenant or anything that would follow the deed chain.
No, it wouldn't. I'd have to look at that form. I mean, you can bind your, successors in interest and things of that nature. However, and Mayor, I understand your concern. I think nobody wants Public Works or anyone to go slapping up paint to cover up something that's in disrepair. However, using that same analogy, I mean, we also have people agreeing that they're going to keep their lawns under 12 inches, and none of us object to the city going in and mowing those lawns. So if we're using an equal footing here for all of our code enforcement issues, that it would have to be an enforcement mechanism that would be maintained, however distasteful we may find it.
I think, not to belabor the point too much, but when you mow a lawn, you know that grass is going to grow back, so it's a temporary deal. If you come in and you start painting somebody else's building, that becomes a little bit more permanent. I'm not trying to be argumentative about it, but I am trying to say that there has to be some way to make sure that certificate of appropriateness perhaps gets viewed from your perspective, and if it needs to be tightened up, so be it.
This is Dana Dixon. I'm just wondering if expenses could come on the city in the future because of mural disrepair, if applications to install a mural should have a different price structure than a regular COA for application for a sign.
We've spent the last so many minutes discussing about how it's going to be attached to the building. And in our current application process, we give the owner of the building and the artist a chance in the application process to tell us what they plan to do. And based on the guidelines, we can say yay or nay to what they are attempting to do. So I think some of this stuff about being applied to a substrate or being applied directly to the building is taken care of in the application process.
And then I'll say, currently, we allow both. And so the debate now is, are we going to continue to allow both? Do you have an opinion on that, sir?
My opinion is I'm still in favor of allowing both and let the application process help determine the final project.
And that's fine. We can certainly keep it that way as everyone's weighing in. I just want to remind you, if the end goal is to create less confusion in the process, then your goal would be to provide more objective standards, less subjective standards. And in the event that we say, we can do this or that, you are going to continue to see more appeals.
Right.
And that's okay if you're comfortable with the process. I'm just noting it for your consideration. As you are making decisions as policymakers, the ramification of having less objective standards means you will have more subjective appeals.
Julie?
I just, there's a scenario out there that we haven't talked about, and that is if somebody goes bankrupt, they lose their building, it's sitting there. That would be an instance where I think the city would come in with codes enforcement and have to take, that would be the only scenario that I would think would justify if the building ownership, I look at what we went through with, was it the Clay building? How many years did it take? How painful was that? And that scenario, I think, is something where you would have to make that tough decision to come in and paint over something if it was ugly. I don't know.
I would like to say that no matter what, if it comes down to the city doing something, painting over something or taking something down, and as our lawyer pointed out, it's really a time issue and how much work is going to go into it, but it's the same optics. We're taking something down, we're painting something over. Yeah, that's all. To me, it's the same issue.
So what's your feeling on it? What's your
Oh, I'd keep it.
thumb up or thumb down?
I would keep it on, I would allow it both on painted and, my honest to goodness preference is that it goes on something else and then gets put it up. That would be optimal. That being said, I have nothing against painting over painted surfaces.
Right, and one other thing that I don't think that we have talked about, if a building downtown, if the paint begins to fail, chip, peel, fall off, codes enforcement does tell them that they need to address their building. So then you get into a situation where you have a building owner who is ultimately responsible for that building going, nah, I'm not gonna deal with this mural, I'm just gonna paint over the bloody thing. So then you get into that situation between the agreement with the artist, the agreement with the building owner. You know, if codes enforcement is in fact forcing them to paint their building, to clean up peeling and chipping paint, because from their perspective, it's paint. It is just paint. If it's peeling paint, it matters not whether it's a mural, it's just peeling paint. So just keep that in mind also. It's not so much that the city is gonna go in and actively repair or replace something, but they may force a building owner to address an issue of failing paint.
To me, if a mural is painted on a building, that is the property of the building owner.
Correct.
And if the building owner decides at some point,
Well,
then yes, sir?
And I'll defer to council, but there are copyright laws that could complicate that.
Oh, well, in that case, that is actually, it's like, you can talk about that. I think that should all be addressed from the get-go.
And
Yeah,
that was my
that's right.
idea when we had our initial conversations about having a general release where the artist is saying up front, I have no intellectual rights to the product. Now, whether you get an artist to sign that or not would be another thing, but therein lies the issue, because there are terribly complicated issues that can arise that the city should say, do we want to invite them into the community to provide a potential scenario where the city is at odds with an artist because a property owner hasn't properly maintained them. So simply because an artist is commissioned to perform a certain project, they do have the ability to waive their rights. I mean, it is a temporary piece of artwork by its very definition. And so you have the ability to say, if we're going to allow them, we request a general release and waiver so as to prevent some of these mechanisms. Now, in practicality, that may prevent you from getting certain artists. I don't know. It may not.
To me, that is an unquestionable practice. To me, that we definitely need to have that.
I think it would be certainly recommended and a best practice.
This is Brandon Long again. Could somebody please clarify, as we're talking about all these disrepair murals and like, oh, what if the paint starts crackling and fading? Could somebody please clarify the difference between what we're talking about in terms of contemporary murals versus like the murals that you see on the tops of the buildings that we currently have downtown? Is there a certain date to which a mural becomes protected and is allowed to fall on that level of disrepair? Like, for example, the mural on the side of Harvey's, that's the rolling papers.
Yeah, that's not considered a mural. Actually, it's a shadow sign. A ghost sign, sorry.
Are there particular dates on that?
When do you go from one to the other?
It is when the building actually becomes listed as National Register contributing structure. There are specific guidelines within the National Park Service dealing with historic murals, which generally date 50 years or back, depending on the building itself. I know exactly what you're talking about. If you go through a lot of these downtowns, you're going to see Haley's Feed Store. That is protected through the National Park Service and their guidelines. So that there's a very distinct difference between that. And there's generally a 50-year cutoff. It has to be 50 years or older, and the building has to meet certain contributing factors as well.
And I'll also say we have rules in our guidelines about those ghost signs. You cannot take them off. You cannot paint over them. You can't do anything except let them age their normal little lives.
That's correct.
And by very definition, these murals that are approved here are being prevented from being able to achieve that status.
Well, to get us maybe moving along, I don't know, but since we're going to have several opportunities for tweaking this and public comment and stuff, my preference is to allow them on both. So I would recommend that, and then as we go along the process, we may decide that's not the best route and change directions based on some further research or what other towns do. But I'd say to move along, I would say
Tiffany Luttrell, code enforcement staff, but I think as far as code enforcement goes, we need to have some guidelines, stipulations. How long are we going to give them to repair a mural that's in disrepair? I mean, we give them 5 days to mow their grass. If they don't mow it, then we go back out, check it, and then we have it mowed. But like, just say, for instance, the artist that painted the mural for the Heart of Danville, she had a scheduled time slot to be in here to paint that mural. You know, what if she's in another city, another state, somewhere, you know, and it takes her a while to get back to what do we do from the code enforcement standpoint in that?
And I think we can answer that quickly in this regard. When we drafted the revisions to the ordinance, we made it intentionally to allow the code enforcement staff to have discretion. So upon the issuance of a notice of violation, they would typically say, we want them repaired within 30 days, for instance. However, in the event that a property owner has said, I can come up with a plan in 30 days, but the actual changes can't be implemented for 60 or 90, that is completely reasonable. We left it intentionally vague so as to allow the discretion of code enforcement staff.
Under the, this is Brandon Long again, under the Visual Arts Artist Rights Act of 1990 that Dana mentioned earlier, the artist has 90 days notice before anything happens to their mural, and that's a United States law there.
However, that's what that's what I'm going back to the waiver. Just because you have a right doesn't mean you can't waive it. And so by very nature of the waiver, I would say the city needs to take control of that process and not allow the federal law to apply. If it's waived by the artist, then there's not an issue.
So I guess my question basically is, and I'm not sure, Stephen, how we need to handle this. I will defer to you. Do we take a poll of both boards of what they want to see done? Is there some action that needs to be done, or do we just want to take comment and move on?
I think we've heard from several members. I don't know if we've heard from a majority of them or not at this point. I think the temperament so far has been expressed that it should be allowed on both, but we haven't heard from everyone. Does anybody else care to chime in? And if not, we'll simply take that as an answer.
Okay. All right, thank you.
How's the board feel?
Oh, sorry. We
got-
moved too quick.
I got to leave in a few minutes. I have another appointment. The 5 years. The owner and the artist and the city have this agreement. I sell the building and someone else buys it and they no longer want the mural on the side of the building. What's the commitment and who's the commitment to for this 5-year minimum commitment?
The city is only saying it's appropriate for 5 years, so it's permitted for a 5-year period. If
Right.
it's less than that, the city has no dog in that fight.
Okay. But it becomes a fight between the owner and the artist.
That's right. If I were a property owner and I had a mural on my building and I was gonna sell it and it was important for me or I had an agreement that it would stay in that time, I would put a restriction in my deed that said it's subject to this mural being in place, which expires on such and such day. But that would be, again, upon the property, it's a contractual thing between a property owner and a successor purchaser at that point.
Or it's contractual at the beginning and understood that if you put a mural on my building, then, and I decide to sell it, but the potential buyer wants it fresh, then I have the right to do that.
Sure.
Okay, folks, we'll move on. Materials, we've really never had an issue with any of the CO applications about the materials that are applied to the building.
You would?
Oh, the one on Gypsy Run? Yeah. Well, yes, we have then. I'm sorry, I misspoke. It is the best practices.
It was spray paint.
Spray paint luminescent.
Yeah.
Not that the board chose to review that.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's quite all right. That's all right. As I meant, generally speaking, we have not had those issues. But you're right, we have. That was brought up to me, so that's on me. Those were spray paints.
Yes.
Which
part, the spray paint or the luminescent?
Yes.
Both.
Yes.
Because the Bunny Davis mural is also spray paint.
It's not attached to
The building.
It's not on the masonry.
So the fact that it's substrate makes it okay. But spray paint directly on the building is not okay.
Yeah, well, so think it's, I'm sorry.
I mean, there was just no treatment.
Done. So
Prior-
spray paint has a much less,
Yeah.
a lower lifespan than house paint. It really does. And so if it's on a panel, well, honestly, you just take the panel down, it goes away. And it wasn't done for that, actually, and as you recall, that was done for the Soul of Second Street Festival. It was only later that the person who owns it came to us and said, hey, I'd like to put this up, can I?
Okay, so basically, the best practices are high-quality materials must be used, exterior grade paints are required. And then there's the question about the anti-coating and anti-graffiti coating and sealants for public art. So I'm not sure that we have any issue that we need or should require high-quality paint. I think that's pretty much a given, and everyone agrees to that. So is there any discussion about what type of paint should be applied to the building?
What is your
He's
opinion?
saying bingo. We have these little private conversations, but we just approved something that you guys had disapproved, and we never heard anything about the issue being a lack of high-quality materials. And somebody said the commission didn't ask. Well, my response is that really it's not our job to ask. It's somebody else's job to let us know what
Would you
the real
pref-
issues are for the rejection of an application.
Correct.
Would you prefer that we provide you with a statement as to why we deny a mural?
Absolutely.
Which is
Absolutely.
what I think we should do.
Absolutely.
Okay. Not just rely on the minutes.
Mhm.
Okay.
I will also say that when the process works and people come before us, we have the discussion about
Right.
materials here. Joni speaks to them, walks them through what's required, and it's a low bar. I mean, house paint, you can get it anywhere. So when things come before us and we have the communication that we're supposed to, these things get addressed.
Gotcha.
What's this coating and sealants?
There's numerous products out there to seal and coat for graffiti, which makes the removal of spray paint and other paints thrown onto it or other items thrown onto a mural or any type of public art easy to remove. They go the range of being fairly modestly priced to exorbitantly expensive. What is expensive is the removal of graffiti from any type of murals or public art. I've spoke with several city managers that have a nightmare trying to come up with, and this just does not apply only to painted murals. This could be if someone puts a bronze statue in downtown and someone throws paint on it. It can be quite expensive to remove that. So a lot of towns are requiring sealants and anti-graffiti coating. Now there's there's no set standard of what product you must use. That would be up to, I'm assuming, yes, sir.
A question, Joni, and I hadn't really thought of this because up front I'm thinking, oh, a sealant or coating would be pretty nice. But I think Manager Millicron mentioned that some of those may actually cause damage, not allowing the brick to, even though it's painted, it's still somewhat greased.
That was random. The artist said it.
You may, I think Ron may,
He talked about paint.
David.
I think.
David.
He talked about paint, he talked about sealant.
Do you have a comment, sir?
The reality is if you're going to paint a building, you might as well seal the mural itself, because by painting on the historic building, you've already affected a form of sealant.
Okay.
And so the anti-graffiti is really for vandalism, if you will. So the purpose of the anti-graffiti and sealant on lots of measures is for graffiti and vandalism. So it allows us to be able to very quickly take off that graffiti or vandalism of whether it's a sign, whether it's art or otherwise.
So do you require, just so that I understand the difference between, so do you also then require, will we going forward require anti-graffiti coating and sealants on all painted buildings or only murals? Because it would be equally, wouldn't it be equally difficult to remove graffiti from a regularly painted wall, or you just figure because you can just go in and paint over it, you don't care? It's only because you'd have to repair that it would matter.
Exactly. If a wall is painted, you can paint over that fairly easily. If it's a.
As opposed to trying to like repair around it. Okay, got it.
Yes. Or put the artwork back to some reasonable thing that everyone is in agreement upon. So that is basically the question.
And then I'll add that when it comes to taking graffiti off of artwork, it is not the city's problem unless the owner makes it the city's problem. My honest opinion would be to leave that up to the artist doing the work with recommendations from the committee saying, you could do this and it'll help you out down the line.
So let's iterate that on the statement of it's not the city's responsibility to address graffiti. We have code enforcement guidelines. So if you actually have, say, a swastika that shows up on the side of the property, you have a certain amount of time to resolve that, or the city will do it for you.
I believe that's what I said.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Is it the city's problem?
Yes, yes. I just want to make sure that we're very, very clear on the issue of graffiti in communities. So it tends to become the city's problem very quickly. So.
My only point to that is that whether it's a swastika or a little lamb, I think the problem is the same.
Yes.
If you have anything that is put up without a certificate of appropriateness, it will be removed in the same manner, absent an evaluation of the content that's there, in compliance with the most recent Supreme Court ruling.
Did you say little lamb?
Little lamb.
Little
Yes.
lamb.
I mean, I was trying to just think of whatever would be as
Or a little lamb
non-objectionable
with
as
a
possible.
All right.
Yeah.
I do have young kids, so we read Mary Had a Little Lamb, so maybe that's on my mind.
All right.
I mean, most often, this issue shows up on vacant properties where graffiti or tags, gang sign tags, things of that nature show up. So from a public policy standpoint, yes, it's addressed pretty quickly.
Sounds to me, Joni, like number one's answer is yes, and number two's is with strong advice that you cover it, or you'll be liable for fixing it.
Okay.
We certainly don't want to damage the artwork. I mean, we don't have the expertise on staff. So if it's why we sort of really recommend the anti-graffiti coating sealants, is because when Public Works shows up with a spray washer to take off the graffiti, they don't have the expertise to make sure that the actual mural or artwork is, so that's just the reality of, and so no good deed goes unpunished. The next thing you know, we've destroyed a mural or altered a mural, and so.
Currently, the guidelines say that the anti-graffiti coating is strongly recommended. So the basic question is, do we want to require it?
Have we had any use, the anti-graffiti coating?
No, not to my knowledge.
I think the only time you require it if it were being applied to a unpainted building.
And it wouldn't be.
It wouldn't be.
It wouldn't be on an unpainted building.
No.
Okay. Then I don't see any reason to do it.
So we will leave the guidelines as they are, strongly recommended.
Mhm.
Okay. See, this isn't as painful as you thought it would be.
Are you having your say? I mean, I'm afraid we're just kind of moving on.
I saw nodding heads there. and I
Okay,
think,
okay. I just didn't want to make it want to seem like we were just, heading down the road without you. We want to go there together.
As long as we're covering it in the certificate of saying we strongly suggest that, I think that kind of pushes the responsibility. Say, hey, we told you,
Mhm.
now we need you to fix it. So
Okay, good, okay.
I'm comfortable with it.
All right.
And I'll add that if anybody doesn't want to speak out here because they're shy, you have their contact information.
Yes, absolutely, too. We will take public comment for 2 weeks on this, and I'm going to give you all my information at the end of this. And we do strongly suggest that you all give public comment, and that will be reflected in the first draft of this.
There are no shy people in here.
I don't think so.
This is not about graffiti, I promise. Before we move on from public art best practices, one of the things that I felt like isn't addressed, and so I don't know if this is the place for it, and if not, tell me, is we talk about high quality materials, but there's nothing in the current guidelines now or proposed that I see up here about vetting the quality of the artist. And I'm not talking about content and whether you like their work. I'm talking about making sure you have an artist that has a proven body of work, that knows what they're doing. I can't think of a lot of content that I think would really negatively impact Danville. That's me. I can think of a lot of poorly executed public art that would negatively impact. You do not want me painting a mural on any contributing or non-contributing building. I promise you don't want that. But nothing in our guidelines, and honestly, I don't know the answer to this, so I'm only asking the question, which I know is sometimes obnoxious, but I don't know exactly how you do that other than some statement that please only use artists who know what they're doing.
So, wait, no, we really want to say this, and this comes from the entire board, that the only thing that this board cares about is where it is, how it's applied, the materials that are used, the size and the maintenance. Anything dealing with the artist, what it's in, is not a part of our purview.
And,
That was what I was going to say.
And I understand the concern there. The only issue is that, I always like to use your question, apply it to a different set of facts and still see if it makes sense. But if we were going to do a new construction, there was going to be, let's say when Heritage Community Bank built their structure downtown, the city doesn't want to be in a business of evaluating the general contractor or their engineers that are employed, because it somehow brings you into some liability. Whether the engineer runs off with the money or builds a shoddy structure, then at the end of the day, whether the artist has qualifications or not, the work may or may not pass the bar. So good artists can make bad mistakes, as good contractors can make mistakes as well. So it doesn't seem necessarily, I understand the concern. I think the city would want highly qualified individuals with artistic ability to perform the work. However, we wouldn't be in the business of clearly vetting their credentials.
That's up to the building owner and the sponsor.
That's right. If it was my building, I would want to make sure I saw a list of qualifications, but ultimately it's on them.
And I agree with you, but then one side of me says every artist has to have a first piece of work. So where do they start?
Indoors and on the iPads.
Right next door.
On your garage. No, that's fair.
If a sponsoring agency chooses the artist that people aren't happy with the result, I guess public condemnation would come your way.
As long as it is applied correctly to the building.
A lot of times in some of the past instances we have seen, and through the certificate of appropriate process, that the applicant has attached photographs of prior works of the artist to give samples of the quality of the work. So while it's not a requirement, I think in practice it's seen as a way to bolster the application. which is encouraged. And I think the
Yes.
DHB appreciates and likes to look at a body of work when making their
Certainly.
decision.
I think it would be so helpful if we could all agree that you have to go through the process. You have to apply before you do the mural. You have to submit, because if they're showing up and they've already painted half the mural, it's a tough decision. You know, we got to get the word out there that you can't just do it. You have to, there's a process. So I think communication is going to be key here.
Yeah, you make an excellent point. We talked about it previously, about educating our community, not only on murals in the process, but a lot of other things that needs to be done to operate in our city, so.
Seems to me a way to clean that up is just to draw the line. If you start the process without seeking appropriate approval, it's disallowed.
We did that.
Period. Period. Period.
We did that.
Yeah, I know you did.
Not to make you look
But it wasn't all clear in the transcript either, because you had some people on your board that wanted to approve that. I'm saying it's automatic. It's not questionable. It's automatic. Now, if they,
That would be great.
well, I mean, you've got to clear it up. You've got to clear it. Otherwise, you're back into ambiguity. So now, if they want to reapply, fine. But it's disallowed. You got to take it down, start over.
And how would we, is that an code enforcement ordinance? How would we do that, actually? I'm not sure that in our design guidelines we can.
It wouldn't be in the design guidelines.
No.
However, I mean, this goes back to our code enforcement ordinance, that staff would have the authority to do that as written on the books today. Correct. So a notice of a violation or a stop work order is issued, staff could abate it or request it be stopped or removed. However, we go back to the fact of, it was a goal of prior commission upon enactment of that ordinance to provide code enforcement staff discretion based upon the circumstances. Hardline rules sometimes create unintended consequences, sometimes not. So I think it would leave staff with the ability to make a determination in conjunction with who they're reporting to, whether or not it was intentional or not, or was there an intent to deceive the process, or was it clearly a case of not understanding? I'm not providing the answers. I'm just saying, when we say if you do X, it's going to be Y, then that may be what you want, and that's fine. But then you are probably going to have, particularly in this community, you're going to have people who say, "But I want an exception."
And under
Well,
this one,
I think go ahead.
I was just going to say, under that one, we were enforcing the DAHB ordinance, and they had a right to appeal to you. So we put a stop work order and got them to agree on that, but then they have the right under that to appeal. So we would have to fix that somehow to say that if it's...
Yeah, and see, anytime you start planning for these things that have a low probability of occurring, it becomes overly complicated and burdensome in an ordinance format and hard to read and hard to enforce, frankly. So in the prior instance, a stop work order was issued, and an application was made, which was denied. The appeal process came to you and it was approved. So in my mind, DHB did what they felt was in their best interest in accordance with the guidelines that were in writing. It went to you, and you had a different interpretation of it and a different result. To me, that's precisely the process that should occur. If you are gonna, you could have been a rubber stamp of the underlying decision and said, "Nope, got to start over." But for the set of facts that were before you, you made a different decision. The fact of the matter is, do you want to remove that ability to have discretion from you as the ultimate policy deciding board for this community? While you don't like appeals, the buck stops with you as the highest ranked elected officials in the community. So where else does the burden lie? I'm hearing that you may want to push that downward, and if so, you make a hardline rule. But it interferes with their right of appeal.
So I know Nikki has something to say, but if you don't mind, you're right in my court here, what I wanted to say, and you may be the same, but I think that we want to be business friendly, and I think that maybe we should change a little bit how it goes. In other words, code should say, you didn't apply, you did the wrong thing, stop. Let me educate you on what you should be doing, and if they can follow through and appease this board, then I think we're good. But if they can't appease the board, they have the right to appeal. But I don't think the right to appeal should be the first decision they have to make.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. So the process that you just described is precisely what occurred in the situation we're talking about with Gypsy Run.
And that is precisely why we're here, because there is ambiguity and conflict. And I'm trying to say from the get-go, eliminate the conflict. If you start down this road, it's denied, period. And it's removed, and you start all over. And that removes any conflict from these folks, any conflict from us, and we start over. And at that point, when you start over, you ought to be able to get it resolved without conflict from that point forward.
All right, let's continue my exercise. Let's apply it to something different. Something happened in this community with the Gilcher building. Let's say windows are installed, a certificate of appropriateness is not received prior to the installation of windows. Are you saying at that point, you say, you're not going to get a certificate appropriate for those windows. We're not going to even evaluate whether they're appropriate or not. Take them out, chuck them, and then they reapply with the same window and it's applied? That seems somewhat...
No, because at that point, it's a different deal. At that point, you have a reset. So let's take that example,
Okay.
because it worked that way. Work was stopped, and they were told that if you're going to continue forward, this is the kind of window that you're going to put in there. And so they did stop. They did get a different kind of window. And we're glad that they did, because it looks a whole lot better today than it would when they first started. So that's what I'm trying to, that's a great example.
Sure.
Thanks for bringing that one up.
But I'm using I'm twisting the facts of that a little bit. Let's say that they used the best, the windows that are in there now that were ultimately approved. Let's say they used those first, and they didn't get a COA for them.
Mm-hmm.
But then they applied for a COA and got it,
Mm-hmm.
based on what was currently there.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me a bit misplaced to say just because you proceed and something was ultimately approved, you got to chuck it and start over.
Well, in that instance, I don't think it would have been a problem, because you could have said, yes, you need to stop. We're going to assemble the board. Okay, everything's fine. We just needed to make sure we're all on the same page here. Proceed.
Right. But that's not but you're not using the same analysis for the mural situation. You're saying if a mural is started without a COA, it has to be scrapped and start over. So what I'm saying is, to have uniformity across the design guidelines, you have to treat each instance the same.
Okay.
Can I say, this is funny, interesting enough, because the Board of Adjustments deals with this a lot of times. We actually had a mural painted on Houstonville Road, painted up, no sign permit. And the confusion was, they didn't know they needed a sign permit for a painted mural outside of the historic district. So our zoning ordinance is very clear. It says, the Board of Adjustments shall not approve any variance if it's a willful violation of the zoning ordinance. So then what's willful? And luckily for us, we go to circuit court on our appeals, and we have attorneys on a lot of sides. They help us define what willful is or isn't. And then the staff comes in and has to determine. The artist said, look, I didn't understand that a painted mural outside the district was a sign and couldn't be this big because I saw him downtown. So we determined that's probably wasn't willful, unless he's just a good liar. Seemed reasonable. They were shrugging their shoulders and said, in fact, we'll be glad to do whatever you tell us, including pay $325 to get a variance and go before a board to see. So we told the board it was not a willful violation, in our opinion. Had it been a willful violation, the board would have had to deny it. That happened with the carport on St. Mildred that went in too close to the property line. We had an argument, was that willful, was it not willful? And if it's not, we will take applications after the fact, and we will let the construction stop in place, be evaluated in front of the board, and then move forward if it's approved. If it's denied, then it has to go. So that language may be, being if it's a willful violation or some language similar, Stephen could think through that. That's what gives us guidance on every kind of violation out in the city, whether it happens after the fact or on the front end of a permit. We get a lot of things built without permits,
I appreciate
and that's how
this.
we go that route.
Thanks for your suggestion. I'd ask the board's comment on that.
I have a comment. I don't want to debate with our attorney, but I'm wondering if there is not a difference between approving windows, which is part of a historic structure, and a temporary 5-year mural.
I understand the reason for pause there. However, we have one process for any COA. We have one process for appeal. And from an equality standpoint and insurance of due process, that's critical to the legal process. So while you can differentiate that on your end, I completely understand that and can even sympathize with it. But from a legal perspective, that would not be permitted.
So again, I'd like board's input on the concept of determining willfulness or not.
Your Honor, I would.
Your Honor.
Yeah.
I'm not judge.
Mayor, Your Honor. But I would defer back to the city attorney, but in light of what Mr. Hunter has mentioned, that maybe adding an element of willfulness to our ordinance might tend to clarify this just a little bit and give us a path forward. I thought that was very enlightening, so I appreciate Mr. Hunter being here.
So there's a good suggestion.
Yeah, if I may chime in. The reality is that most folks don't know the intricacies of government or the codes. People do good things with good intent all the time, and if everyone knew all of the codes and followed all the codes, we would not need code compliance. The reality is that it's the checks and balances. We're the eyes and ears. We see things, and you know, in the most diplomatic way, we should be approaching them and say, you know, I hate the fact that you've started on a mural or this window project or this plumbing project, and we're going to have to ask you to stop. We have a process, and you walk them through the process. The reality is in most communities, for instance, like if you put up a sign and you fail to go through the process, then you know, they charge you double of what the permit fee would have been. There's always mechanisms to sort of have the carrot and stick, but the reality is that folks in the community that own every building will not know that they have to contact the city to put a piece of art on the side of their building or do a mural, and that's part of, we can educate and educate and educate, but it's the same thing with anything else in our code. So from a staff perspective, to tell them to stop, unravel, and go back to start, if you will, like a Monopoly game, is very disenfranchising in the community. Versus we need you to stop. We're going to walk you through the process. There is a process. If you don't like the result that the process has given you, then there's a matter for appeal. And that's why there's always the checks and balances. And it does allow you to sort of continue to move the pendulum forward, if you will. And they may or may not achieve what they want. Sometimes the more appropriate way is to say, you know, and most communities don't have a fee for their COAs. I'm assuming we don't either. Some have imposed fees, but you know, they say ignorance is an excuse in the law, but the reality is most folks, you know, don't know when they have to get a permit or not. So when we find it, we contact them, we involve ourselves, we try to set them on the right path. They don't like the fact that we've stopped them, and yes, there sometimes is some consternation, but that's the job of code enforcement, is to get you back on that track and hopefully get you down the path that you want to ultimately accomplish. But there's a criteria for deciding whether or not you're going to head on down towards the station, and that is whether or not you get through the COA process, and if they stop you, whether or not the ultimate appeal authority is going to allow you to pass go as well. So from us, no. we do not want to say, take that off, stop it, shame on you, get it off, and then if you decide you want to go back to go and start. The more appropriate way is yes, we're going to stop you, which is an automatic inconvenience, and then get you through the process, which will take time. And that's whether it's a mural, it's whether, you are altering your home or changing out windows or anything else, if you will. We're supposed to be the folks here to help you, not hinder you, if you will.
And I'm sorry, who was? I would just add that you both make excellent points and have swayed me in my vicious, what I can't stand dealing with kind of thing and punishing the wrong. But anyway, but no, you all have made excellent discussion on why that's a bad thing. Just be aware, just full disclosure, I actually voted for the Gypsy Run mural, but for various reasons. But when the board makes a decision, I stand with the board. And we all agreed that, okay, they agreed, it's like, okay, we're not gonna do this. And so then we push it forward. And I see I went back and reviewed their COA. Their COA was incomplete. Normally we put in things like material, you agree to use materials, you have a plan to keep it going. And so it looks like you all got an incomplete packet. It looks like that not all the information was there. And so we need to very much have something in line for, okay, we are saying no because of all of these detailed things that you might, and honestly might hear or read and not quite understand what we're talking about, especially when it comes to material things, unless you're all experts on paint, which is fun. But very much I think we should include a report that says this is exactly why we denied them and this is why we think you all should stand with us.
And if you got an incomplete packet, shame on us, and we'll take responsibility for that, and we should have a checklist, because nothing should move to any board that isn't ready to move forward. We've made some changes with the commission, for instance. Before packets can go to those, I actually review them and sign off on them. So from your board, there ought to be a checklist. And no packet should go to any board that's not complete. That's why you have the option to postpone or bring it back. So if that occurred, my apologies to you.
If I can only make one more comment on that too. The staff that is present at your meetings is intended to provide guidance to you, but they're not authorized to create things that are not specifically authored by you. Meaning, if there are reasons in which you deny, it's critical when you make a motion to substantiate the reason for the motion, you provide the written or the oral statement of why it's being denied and what was incomplete. Therefore, a proper motion would be something like, I move that we deny the certificate of appropriateness for whatever mural because there are insufficient materials as they don't comply with this section. It is adhered to the structure in a manner that is not in accordance with our rules and regulations. There's not a maintenance plan. I understand if the packet wasn't complete, it would be only the fault upon the city in the event that you made a motion and made certain things that weren't incorporated into the packet. So there's a double-edged sword here. Staff needs to guide you through that process to provide affirmative reasons for a denial, but there's also a burden upon the members to provide concrete reasons for denial. Staff is not in a position and unauthorized, and I would tell them they are prohibited from adding things to the record that you don't specifically stipulate. That's a lot. I'm not saying it's not, but we are past the days where it's sufficient to say we deny the COA. Or, conversely, we approve it. It's equally as important to say why you approve it. And those are submitted through the annual report to the Heritage Council, and because they need to review those types of things. So part of this is an education for all of us, at which time the members need to also assume responsibility for making sure that your motions are in compliance with the guidelines and that you provide as much documentation and reason for your decision.
My motions are beautiful.
I'm sure they are.
If I may, Nikki, you've been waiting.
Nikki Kincaid. I'm sorry, I'm regressing a little. I appreciate very much what you said. it seems as though, well, my question is, how do people within the historic overlay receive this information? Do any business owners, if you're a contributing facility or building, do they know this? And do they get does everybody in the district get a copy of the guidelines? And if they do, I would think, like you said, not everybody knows everything about, but it is on them then, their responsibility, because you've told them that they need to know this, versus just putting it on social media or saying it's here, because there'll be some new guidelines now soon. How will all of the people in the overlay know this?
We've done all of those things, Nikki, over the years. A couple years ago, we had a certified local government grant where we sent a brochure to every property owner in the historic district overlay. We put it on social media. We meet with them individually. Joni's going to be going around to each property owner as she has time to talk to them and explain those things. But even when you explain them, sometimes people still don't follow through the guidelines. But we do very diligently try to make sure that they know what those guidelines are and what the rules are. And when they call and ask questions, when they call Joni or call us in the office, we walk them through what the process should be. So we're trying.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, particularly when you make changes to it. Now, this information will have to go to every entity.
Oh, yeah, and I go knock on a lot of doors. I try to do business in downtown, so they see my face and they know who I am, and not that I'm just the historic preservation police coming after them. But, it's good to visit with property owners, let them know if they have any questions. I'm happy to answer them, and I get calls all the time. Can you tell me if I need to put this in for a door? So that is working. And unfortunately, part of the problem with Gypsy Run, I was not able to be on staff for those 3 months for situation with Commonwealth of Kentucky. I had to be off a certain amount of time because I retired from the state.
So all of this is your fault?
It's all my fault. No, sir, it is the Commonwealth of Kentucky's fault. So I try very hard to reach out and talk with people. I've talked with Gypsy Run several times on work they've done to their building. I've been over there numerous times. But unfortunately, things like this happen. So we want to try to tighten up these guidelines so that they're less frequent.
All right, but in fairness, using a different example. So I have a management team. We've met with the management team. We put out a request for proposal for an insurance broker. We had discussion with the management team. We sent communication out in writing to all of the employees. We put things in their payroll checks. We went before the commission. The number one question coming in HR is, so our insurance is changing? So you can educate, communicate, educate, communicate, educate, and communicate. You will still have folks that don't, and we all understand and learn differently. So although I applaud everything that staff does, there will still be a need for us to engage, and folks still are going to say, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Or, contractors come in that don't ever see any of this. So it's always our job. We always tell the public, be our eyes and ears. Let us know. Call us. Same thing with the commission. Be our eyes and ears. Tell us what's going on. As we're out, we're trying to be the eyes and ears. The reality is that you'll never be finished educating folks on the process, and we'll continue to move forward. But it goes back to, we don't want to shut you down and shut you out. We want to be able to get you inside the club and move you forward as part of the team.
Julie?
The silver lining is the mural in question is not publicly visible per se, unless you question the little bit of feet. So I think in this case, we got to learn and change on a mural that's somewhat hidden. So
that does beg this question.
Which goes to the next.
Right, to the next question. If something is not visible from the right-of-way or public roadway, it begs the question, should an application be required?
They are.
And is it public?
So right now, for everybody's knowledge, we do require, it doesn't matter where it is, if it's a mural, it comes before us.
I understand. I'm saying, should it?
Yes, I know. That's what I'm just clarifying.
Okay, sorry.
Right, and that moves us on to the next slide.
Yeah.
Now, here's the point as historic preservation that I will make to you. If in fact someone puts it on a substrate, or they alter the building, we look at the whole building as a whole. We don't just look at the front facade of a historic building, so that's great. We look at all the facades of the historic building as we're supposed to, according to the National Park Service. So if it is not visible from the public right away and the DAHB board does not have a chance to review it, well, they could remove a door, they could remove a window, they could build something onto the building that obstructs the ability for its historic contribution. They can anchor it badly in a wall, they can drill through mortar. So we're not necessarily looking at the content of that particular mural, more the application of it. So I would pose that question to the board, even though it is not visible from the right of way. And I was asked this specific question, that's why it's there. And you may even asked it, Stephen, I don't remember, or it could have been you. But that is, do we want to continue to review those because they are not visible from the street? We're not looking at content, we're just looking at the application and how the mural is placed upon the building.
You got an ordinance that says the opposite. You got two standards, right?
Correct.
One says yes, one says no.
Right, and in that event, the ordinance controls.
Correct.
Frankly, as far as the weight of the, so and that therein lies some of the issue on the underlying Gypsy Run matter.
Yes.
Because there is a conflict. So I think when there is conflict, now is the appropriate time to determine what is the best manner to proceed, or the chosen manner to proceed.
My druthers are that we continue to review everything just for the structural integrity.
I would agree with that.
Then the question begs, how do we fix this ordinance? What do we need to do to fix this ordinance?
Well, we would just have to strike that provision in the
Okay.
ordinance. It would be a rather simple amendment. The question is, just from a policy standpoint, does it, from an application standpoint, or are the standards different for something that is viewed as wholly private or wholly public? I understand like materials, and you're talking about structural integrity of the building, things of
Correct.
that nature. But as far, and we're not looking at content, mind you. So if they're true just applicability standards, then I think that would be probably okay.
We do review if windows get changed, if doors get changed, it doesn't matter where they are, we still review those as well.
Right. I'm just saying, is there a different, sometimes we say, like, we want certain materials to be placed, and you often hear applicants say, yeah, I'm going to use all these materials, and however, in the back section, there's one section I'd like to use vinyl, which is generally prohibited, but it's not visible, and the board makes exceptions in those types of situations that they would not make for the frontal facade
Correct.
of the structure. So I'm saying there's a different analysis that applies, even if it's not maybe concrete in the ordinance. I guess the compelling interest of the public, I would say, is much less in an invisible portion, as long as the structural integrity of the building is maintained. If people concur with that or not, that's my interpretation.
I completely agree.
Okay.
Maybe I missed a sentence somewhere, but can we define public right-of-way? Visible from a public right-of-way? This is Mimi Becker. Because I think that, are you talking about just like what's a main street, a state highway? What's a public right-of-way?
A right-of-way would be a public street, sidewalk, and any easement on the side of a roadway.
Even Larimore Lane counts as public
Okay,
right-of-way.
well, so in the Gypsy Run situation, it is visible, correct? From a public right-of-way. Okay, I just was getting a little confused with some of the language floating around.
I think that where it would be more complicated, if you're going to have, let's go back to the freestanding public art. If we're going to have a bronze statue, and I'm going to put it in, let's say behind Gypsy Run, they're going to put a bronze statue of whatever to complement the mural.
A baby lamb.
A baby lamb, let's do that, a baby lamb. Then in that situation, would a certificate of appropriateness be required? It's freestanding, but is it public art if it's not viewed from the right-of-way?
That is a good question.
Or maybe more appropriately, if it's a fountain that is not viewed from the right-of-way in the back to add to the ambiance of the commercial enterprise, is it public art?
That's tough.
Right, but if you're saying, if it's not visible from is the deciding factor, it's visibility. If it's visibility and you say it's not visible, then to me, it seems inappropriate that you would ask for a COA. So if you use that same analogy, if you're gonna, let's take the Gypsy Run mural down, and let's say they were gonna just simply paint, I don't know. Yeah, the sidewalk. They were gonna paint a mural on something that was actually on the ground, or they had a concrete patio and they were gonna paint the same thing that they painted but on the ground, not visible. If that was painted at Whitaker Park, it's public art. If it's painted behind their building, is it public art? Well, at that point, it's not on the building, but is it still freestanding public art?
I would say it's not. Anything that you can't see that is not attached to the building, it's not a business. Again, private property. But as soon as you get into on the buildings, architecture, anything like that, we just need to say, are you attaching this appropriately? This is how you need to do it. That's great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so basically I'm hearing that we want to review them just for applicability. That's
How they're being applied.
how they're being applied and materials and of that. Yes? I see a lot of head nodding. Okay.
Yes.
We could have some yays and nays. Wait.
I get lots of head nods.
When we go back and listen to this recording, there's going to be a lot of silence and a few voices.
And using the freestanding public art, let's say I wanted to put a small fountain by my mailbox.
I wish you'd quit talking about fountains.
It's going to cost $100,000.
Oh, please.
No.
And it's going to be beautiful, but it's going to be right by my mailbox. And I'm going to have goldfish in it.
That's very pretty, Steve.
Thank you. If I were to do that, just for clarification purpose, it's visible from the right of way. Is that freestanding public art in the historic overlay? No?
It doesn't matter because staff's going to take it down because it obstructs the visual flow of traffic and it's a safety hazard.
But let's move it 10 feet back and we put it one step off my front porch. I mean, I think what I'm saying is there are conceivable manners in which public art can be implemented in the historic overlay. We can have various levels of
We actually,
influence.
review, if you decide you want to put out permanent furniture in front of your business, we review that kind of stuff too. As long, if you're implying that something is permanent, we're going to be looking at it.
Okay.
If it's a fountain.
There are design guidelines that deal with different things in the landscape. And-
Okay.
And I would assume that would be under that, because that's a lot of expense and, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
It lasts more than 5 years. So 5 years is only a mural.
You all understand, I just want to
That's right.
clarify this point. 5 years is the length we give a permit. You want to keep it, come back. If it's great, if everything's been great, wonderful, we're gonna. It's just, and it's actually, and the 5-year rule was cleared because that's when things can start to deteriorate and you just want to review.
I don't see in
All
our
right, so we
guidelines
have
that
some
we
questions
address
on the
any
big
freestanding
board
art.
here.
Yeah, I think,
it just says public art, and it basically cannot obstruct. It needs to be put in key areas of the city.
There's no real guidelines for that though, right?
There are just a couple, I mean, they're not extremely defined, they're just a couple. Now, the big question that we're going to get into, and this is going to take some time, follow the planning and zoning set sign regulations for zoning districts. Is it a sign? Is art a sign? This is the definition that the zoning ordinance gives us for a sign. Any device, display, or structure other than a building or landscaping which is readily visible from public property and is used primarily for visual communication for the purpose of or having the effect of bringing the subject matter on the device, display, or structure to the attention of persons off the premise on which the sign is displayed. The foregoing definition includes, but is not limited to, numerals, pictorial representations, emblems, trademarks, flags, banners, streamers, pennants, inscriptions, and patterns, and shall include a structure erected or used in connection with the display of any such device and all lighting or other attachments used in connection therewithin. So, not like it. This is the big question. If we are going to, and a lot of communities do, Bardstown in particular does this. If it is painted on a building, it's a sign. They have a specific amount of area in which you can paint that on the facade. I think some of them are 12%. As it is set in the downtown commercial districts, it is either 5 or 10% of the facade. Is that correct, Steve?
It's 5% if it's zoned central business.
Right.
If it's, we have some properties zoned highway business. some
Correct.
properties zoned general business, some properties, we got various zoning districts. Some of them could be 10%, but the central business district, which is the majority of the historic district, it's 5% of the facade is the now wall sign coverage you can do complete on the building.
Correct. And there, I think there are a couple structures that fall under the.
We got a ton of structures or highway business
Yeah,
that are in
and
there.
so that there's a couple different sizes that planning and zoning actually allow that would be incurred in the downtown commercial district. So now the question for you, sir, as I'm looking at you, does this include what we decide is public art?
It can. And before we had design guidelines that dealt with public art, it was the only legal conclusion that we could come up with was that it's a sign. And so while it feels funny to call public art a sign, it is absent a better definition. And so we can define it differently from a sign, but you could also include it as a sign.
And you all wrote that definition in the latest round of the guidelines, right?
Yeah, so this is
Art
where.
versus advertising.
Right, well, so now, you know, the Supreme Court decision that said you can't look at content, it's been filtering through, it's been around for several years now, and it's coming down to, we don't look at content. And so it.
Tell if it's advertising.
Exactly. So it just doesn't matter, is that accurate?
That's right, and that's what one of the implications of that decision was, that it makes, if you have to look at it to determine what it is, it's per se a constitutional violation. So while before we were looking at things that may convey a commercial message and be able to say, yeah, that's more like a sign. Like if I painted on the side of my building somebody drinking a Coca-Cola bottle, but Coca-Cola wasn't visible, you could say, and I was a Coca-Cola vendor or something, then you would say that's a commercial message. However, in a different setting, it would be different, maybe a different interpretation. However, what the Supreme Court has said now is you cannot look at the contents of it. You can simply look at size, applicability, materials, some of these objective things, but nothing subjective as to the content. So that's a content-neutral regulation that is permissible under the Constitution, but nothing else. So therefore, this is the critical part of your decision today. And I don't want us to get hung up with necessarily, is public art a sign or not? But the real important part is just simply, are we going to treat it as the same way?
Correct.
So absent the content, are we going to say it's best practice just to have the downtown district have restrictions that equal what planning and zoning does? Or are we going to have something different than that?
And so I'd like to add, my concern with this is that, yes, I don't want to deal with content anymore. The fact that we can pass it off and call it a sign is great by me. But if we lump it in with all the other sign regulations we have, that can lead to very much smaller murals than what we currently have. And so I'd like to throw it out there and see what people think. Because we don't allow anything on the front, can we have larger, would we be willing to accept larger sign regulations for the sides and backs of buildings?
I'll just say, we don't want to vary. That was one of the problems we had, is we had different sign rules for every side of the building. The front got 64 square foot, the side got 10%, and you had to pick 2 of 4 sides to put your sign on. The zoning ordinance has streamlined that to say we treat all facades equally. Now, I think the design guidelines could go down that road, but I don't think the Planning Commission. And the problem was, we'll just use Starbucks, for example. They wanted to put the Starbucks logo on 4 sides, but our rules here in Danville said pick 2 of the 4 for the logo. We wanted in scale with the building, whether it's Walmart, Starbucks, or J&K Auto, and 5 or 10% is what sort of fits the scale. 10%, depending on the size of the building, could be a very big sign. And we want them in scale on all sides. So we can simply say, look, you put what you want on your building, 10% of each facade, and then the shopping centers can figure out the splits, as opposed to us saying every suite gets this, every side gets this number. That makes it very confusing for business owners to understand what the sign rules. The confusion we've had now has been the murals downtown, because of the variances we've had to prove for J&K. We've got the tattoo place, the still, all of them were confused. What can I paint on my building? Because it seems like we can paint a whole wall, and it's not a sign if it's a mural. We said, no, in outside historic district, it's a sign, and these are the standards, and you either paint it to the standard or you get a variance. There's always an option to get a variance. And that's still an option in the historic district. If they don't like the 5%, they could go through the variance process to get it to be 18%.
So quite frankly, that leads us to be a policy decision more so of the commission than of the DAHB to decide, do you want to have a separate set of rules for the historic district or not for the DAHB to enforce? Do you want to, is it equitable, or do you think it's wise to allow a different set of rules for, let's say, you know, the still, the mural, or the sign on the side of the still, or the tattoo shop or wherever? Should the people in the historic district have different manners, either more limiting or more expansive? That's the ultimate question. I think that's a question of the commission as opposed to the DHB.
I'm going to point out, what's the cost to get a sign permit?
$50 for wall sign.
And just be aware that right now to get a COA, it's free.
So if
Yeah.
you come in on one facade and want to piece them out and do 6 at one time, it's still $50.
And what we did prior to that is we required that planning and zoning issued sign permits, but only upon the application had to have the COA attached to it.
So right now, Mary, if we approve a sign, they still have to go pay $50.
Right, but no, if we had approved the mural, then they have to pay $50.
No,
So just
it's just a difference.
to make sure that everybody's aware.
But they have to go to a what? So they want to bury it? Yeah, if they want to bury it, then that's a separate fee,
It's
correct?
$325 because you have to go to the Board of Adjustments. We have to advertise in our local paper. That's $150 of it right there.
But you know, that is a statutory process, and that has been approved and enforced across the Commonwealth of Kentucky for, goodness, I mean, I don't know what years it was enacted. 66, Steve? Okay, but what I'm saying is there's a method that's proven and accepted, and we have tons of court cases that validate that process. So if you're not trying to reinvent the wheel, there is an alternate method of enforcement and rules that are in place and statutorily accepted, should you choose to employ them. But the ultimate question is, do you want the historic district to be treated differently? In that, do you want it to be more expansive or more restrictive?
I think the posture of the community with regards to its historic district would want it to be treated differently. And I think there's precedent for that. And probably more restricted, because you're trying to accent, in a historic district, you're trying to accent natural architectural features of your downtown. You can get awfully busy if you start to expand on that, and then you begin to lose what you're ultimately trying to accentuate, and that's the fact that it's a architecturally significant downtown.
That would correspond with, you've ultimately said the historic district is different by creation of the overlay. And the rules in the overlay now tend to be more restrictive than what's outside anyway. Using that same thought pattern, approving it to, or applying it to murals rather, it would seem that you would say we're going to limit by percentage in a way that's either consistent with planning and zoning rules or more restrictive. But that puts you to the 5 to 10% rule.
And just so everybody can get a visual, because thinking 5 to 10%, it can be hard. You all know the McDowell Place, the building, they've got their big sign on there. You see how big that sign is? It's because that side of the wall is huge. And so they have a lot to work with, but that can give you an idea of the size.
I was going to ask what size, do we know what percentage the current murals might be?
Oh, probably more like 80.
Well, it depends. I mean, like the Derby Shop one is half of that facade.
Okay.
Yeah, the Derby Shop mural is about 50% of that facade. But I also, in the Bardstown folks, didn't they also sometimes get a little bit of wrangle room by like counting the total square footage of all facades? Did you get to like factor some of that in, and then it was the percentage of the total, or did I imagine that from my conversation with her?
It is the facade it's applied to.
Per se. Because so basically you'd be looking at virtually all murals would require a variance then. Because if you picture the Derby Shop mural, now that's 50%. Take that down to 10%, that's ridiculous. Like, you wouldn't do it. The only one that might fit is the Art Local, depending, but even that I'm not sure. I think that's probably bigger than 10%, even though that's a honkin' big wall. That one even would be, it may be close, but I'm guessing if you think about that's like 4 bays and it's probably closer to 25. So pretty much all murals would require a variance, which my only concern with that then is that kicks us right back into the world of massive subjectivity. Who's getting a variance, and how do you decide who gets a variance then?
We actually have very detailed rules on how we approve variances and review criteria that's laid out in the statute. It's not subjective at all. In fact, the board is somewhat hamstrung because they have to make specific decisions. It can't be a willful violation, can't circumvent the zoning ordinance. There can be hardship factors, and the statute lays out exactly what the board has to prove to either deny or pass a variance, and we tend to pass them because they normally fall in those categories most of the time. We deny a couple a year, but we probably pass 90% of them if they're reasonable.
And Steve, for the sake of conversation too, the sign that is painted on the side of McDaniel Wealth Management, that would give you something that is clearly a sign, not
Yes.
a mural.
It's a sign.
Therefore, it has to comply with the percentage requirement of that building, which is a big facade.
Yeah.
But so that would have the 10% rule apply to it?
That's zone central business would be the 5%. Actually, it's 5% or 96 square foot, whatever's greater is the way the rules read. The
But let
interesting
alone,
thing
you can, so that is just another matter of perspective, depending on the facade. It could be rather large.
Exactly.
Or not. I mean, it's two different things.
It's in scale with the building facade, I guess. And maybe the answer is what Kate's saying is maybe the number in the guidelines needs to be 60% of the facade. And I guess the interesting thing to me is what if the building's 3 stories? I guess the question here is we painting all of a wall, and what if we end up with a 3-story mural on the building that maybe is visible? I don't know if there's a building out there, but maybe it's first floor only, or 60% of the first floor. I mean, I think the design guidelines can go anywhere the commission and the board wants to go. Out in the rest of the public, it's confusing when they see whole walls painted downtown, and then they can't do it outside the district. Or if it's not public artwork in the district, they're limited. For example, I'm going to put a can sign up at the Speedway. I'm limited to the 10%.
A mural should be allowed to be as big as it needs to be. I don't see how, I mean, even if it's 3 stories, if it's attractive, I mean, it could be a tourist attraction. I mean, to get all caught up in size and numbers and comparing it with signs, we could just be cutting off our opportunities.
That's agreed, and Mimi, I'm going to do the same thing as I did with Nick. I want to apologize, but I think that our historic overlay should be different than out on the bypass because we are special, and they're being scrutinized by a board on what's happening here. The bypass being scrutinized by P&Z, but down here they're being scrutinized by lots of different eyes. So I think we ought to be different downtown.
So ultimately, the question remains, though, if you're going to put a percentage on it, what is an appropriate percentage? Remember, because we can only regulate it by size and an application. So.
That percentage decision doesn't have to be made now, and might be if you all could do some mock-ups and just give us an example of, okay, this is a building size, this is 10%, 5%, and a bigger. That would be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
We can do that.
Mimi Becker. It might be safer to go with, say, a standard sign regulation, and then they would go through the variance, because then that would allow you actually more flexibility than attaching, oh gosh, now we're going to say that a sign that might be a mural can be 20%. Well, the next guy who comes along is going to want it to be 30%. So settle on maybe the simpler way to look at it, let it be a sign thing, and then apply for the variance like anybody else. You know, yeah, it costs, but you also are following a very reasonable procedure that's not going to be like, question the next time kind of thing.
Are we then saying that a sign could occupy up to 60% of the facade? If we're going to call a mural a sign? And let's say we go with a 30-60%, are we saying a sign on the front window could be 60%
A sign is a sign and an art is art. They just aren't the same.
There's a microphone right behind you. I think what you need to say is the sign. We have a section on sign, but in public artwork, you could set a different percentage for a painted mural. Well, I'm saying you can.
It's the way they apply for it. They're gonna either.
That's right.
You're gonna get a COA for a sign, or you can get a COA for a public mural or public art. So it's based upon the application, and then it's reviewed under those guidelines.
Okay, wait a minute, I'm confused. I thought we were trying to get rid of that whole thing.
You
and
are.
not worry about comment, but what you just said was that we would have to make decision
It's
what's art,
different.
what's sign.
No. You're not making, the applicant's making the decision. Are they applying for a sign, or are they applying for a mural, a public art? So you can't make that determination.
If I wanted to put up a sign covering half my building, I'd apply for a mural.
How do they decide?
Because it doesn't matter what's in the content. So that's, suddenly you're just giving me an out.
Well, then you're saying then by and large, then there should be, the rules should be the same for both. With the applicant being able to seek a variance in the event that they want to. Like if you wanted to file a COA that wanted to have a sign on your, a public art sign that said Tom Ty Financial, and it covered 60% of your building, it would be denied under the sign ordinance typically. But if you wanted to, if we had the rules the same, you would apply for a variance. The BOA would look at the credentials and say, no, that's a willful violation. They would have the discretion, because it circumvents the planning and zoning ordinance, which is precisely what the statute prohibits. So there's a set of rules, an alternate set of rules there that safeguards what you're trying to apply. The thing is,
If we can do that, yes, but it just suddenly it was like, didn't fit.
right. So that would give credence to the fact that should they be the same? The rules should be the same, and then allow a variance process to proceed if people are comfortable with that.
Janet?
The historic district, that's an overlay district, right? The purpose of an overlay district is to allow you to permit things in that, or not, in that district that don't apply to the primary map as a whole. True?
True. Generally in a more restrictive manner.
Right, but it could be less restrictive, I guess is what you're saying, because of the size of the murals.
Right.
Whatever
In theory,
you-
it could be. It could be, yes.
Whatever you decide, I implore you not to have the unintended consequence of unleashing signs both all out of the district and in the district, which is something we have never done. It's what sets us aside from all the counties around us, most of the counties in Kentucky. I don't know of another county that doesn't allow billboards. But we have not allowed a billboard here since 1967. And that's why when you drive across the county line, you know you've come into Boyle County. So, and all your ideas are good, mine too, but they may have unintended consequences. So just please be cognizant of that as you're putting this all together.
Okay, and so what I'm seeing from the DAHB board is that they are mostly in agreement with treating these as signs. Is that correct?
Oh, say that again, please. I'm not
The
sure I
majority
get-
of the DAHB board is okay with treating these as signs?
No.
But other than you, I said the majority.
Okay, so I'm not a majority. but if I-
Okay, half and half, okay, I'm sorry.
If I stand up.
Okay.
Now, I mean, a mural, it becomes a statement of the visual literacy of the community. And, you know, we see some pretty horrible signs. And I just think it would be a mistake to try to treat them as one thing.
Art is pretty special. I'm not sure it can be lumped in with a traditional metal sign. I just don't.
No, I agree, but unfortunately, we cannot look at content.
Well, and then
That's
so,
true.
I also.
It's an unintended consequence.
It is.
Just to send that message to the community that they're the same.
The other thing to know, well, didn't we just determine that nobody reads our ordinances anyway? But my other thought is that, I mean, when it comes down to it, if we're calling them all signs, can we just automatically have on the sheet, hey, I'm gonna apply for a variance because I believe that this will qualify as a mural, and then just go from there? That way, they wouldn't even have to.
Well, if it's a sign, they would go to planning and zoning, and then they would go through their process.
Well, in that case, you all would still look at how it is applied to the building, you know, and then you could deny it on the size and go through the variance at that particular point.
It just seems silly to put a law on the books that we know everybody's gonna appeal. Why would we do that?
So that we don't have to deal with it. I mean, honestly, as soon as we start saying, if you had asked me on it, I'm sorry, guys, you don't know this. I would have not voted for the art because I think that that's very much advertising. It's got all these letters on it, but it's a mural. And so now are we going to be we're trying to get away from making any distinction. Let people define their own murals. And that's why I like the variance idea, is because it gets kicked up to a very official level that is not us being called Nazis on social media.
I just hate to see
that was true.
I hate to see
No, what I'm saying is I'm laughing because it's just gonna fun them to be called that.
Sorry, Steve.
If I may, I think this board is a little split on a decision, and probably about 5 minutes ago or so, you all looked at Joni and said, can you do more research? And maybe we ought to just leave it right at that. Come back to
I
this.
can certainly do that.
Yeah.
What I can do is when we start the first draft process, when we put it out I can certainly make some mock-ups. I can provide you guys with what other communities do. We can roll that into the second public session. And then it also, again, I want the feedback from you guys. So please send me the feedback, what you think, what your concerns are, and then we can drill down into this to be more specific about what the concerns are.
And Joni, wouldn't you agree that I think in our review of other communities that Danville would be rare in the fact that there's not a percentage limitation?
Yes. Other communities deal with it, there's numerous ways that they deal with it. It can be a certain percentage of the building. It can be treated as a sign.
We talk about Bardstown a lot here.
We talk about
Bardstown.
Bardstown.
Just as a matter of comparison, they prohibit murals on contributing structures. They're only allowed on non-contributing structures. And wherever they are, they're treated as signs and limited to small percentage. I think it's the 5 to 10% range in their historic overlay, just as a matter of comparison. So let's keep that in mind when we say nobody else in Kentucky does it like this. Danville's really hard to get anything through. It's really quite the opposite of that in reality, because Danville would be more permissive than what we would view as our counterparts. And I think that's important to know publicly, to state publicly, and for us to realize when we're going through this policy development process.
Yes, I agree.
And that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying we need to be cognizant of that fact.
And then this is just like, as you're drafting it, to help us figure out like what the really clear order of operations would be on something like that. Because I'm thinking you have to have the COA to request the variance, right? Didn't you have to have your COA, like go to you first and then request a variance? But to come to you, we'd have to have an artist picked out and like all of that figured out first. You would only need to know, so as long as it was, so you wouldn't necessarily anymore, that's actually helpful. Because right now you have to like have your artist, you have to have a design planned already, which makes it hard if you don't even know if you've been given permission to use the space you're looking at. How do you design something if you don't know how much space you're given? But you're saying none of that would be required as long as you then put into your stipulation to the artist, you'll be using this type of material that's already been approved, and this application method that would just go, part of your artist search would be, I know I'm looking for an artist who's going to work on a substrate using this material. Thank you. Okay.
Well, and when we think about this in just a normal planning and zoning perspective, it actually works much more efficiently when you say, no, you don't turn in engineering plans and do technical review prior to getting your zone change, your concept plan, and then your site plan review. So what I'm saying is it makes this decision more linear, as opposed to doing all this upfront work before you even know if it's appropriate.
Yes, I like that. Yes, and that
Which
would be,
helps take away some of the angst and consternation that occurs when a lot of work's been done to something and then it's just denied.
Correct. And what we will do as part of the process too, with the new design guidelines, we will have a process that lines out in place where you need to go first. This is the step you need to take, and that will be laid out so that people understand that process. So we want to make sure the process works smoothly for everyone. So what I'm hearing is we want to table this particular part of it, come back with some recommendations from other communities, some ideas and mock-ups of that. So we won't go into the what size is appropriate or one mural per structure. That can all be part of that discussion. Is that agreed upon with everyone?
Sounds good.
Okay. Yes, oh yeah, no, we're not done.
We're all excited.
No!
I'm gonna make a motion to adjourn.
No, we're not done. But we're basically done because we've pretty much talked about what is on this side, the slide, the maintenance, how we take care of it. We've all agreed that the property owner is responsible for that particular structure. Once that painting is put on there, it's treated as paint. It is the horse he bought, so he or she is responsible for that. Currently, murals are permitted for 5 years within Danville. And I think we've come to the conclusion that we do need some type of general release of liability for the city. And however, we can get with the city attorney to structure that particular document. Is there any questions or discussion about those particular statements?
Would you just add in there that permitted for 5 years and can be renewed?
Certainly.
I think that'll add some comfort to it. Can be a mud renewed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not a problem.
Brandon Long again. I wish that in that first statement that it would say in compliance with the original artist, if at all possible. I mean, I know John Kay would. You know, I don't know if he wants to go out there and try to match Andy Rudloff's red paint out there.
Then we are dealing with content, and we cannot deal with content. Is that?
No, what I'm saying is in compliance. Like, if your paint is peeling, please contact the artist to
That would be
fix
the
the thing.
responsibility of the artist and the owner to make that agreement beforehand. I mean, we are going to be insisting, if you are a smart art person, you are going to say, hey, I want to work with you. This is what I require.
Yeah.
Can you give it to me? And that needs to happen between the owner and the
You
artist.
could build that into number 3, right? Into the agreement.
From the city's perspective, I think pushing that burden completely, maintenance completely to the property owner, and between the property owner and the artist, if they come up with another plan or get an easement, that is completely upon them. I think that is rightfully placed there without the city, monitoring that situation.
Okay.
And hopefully that's limited based upon the 5-year duration, that within 5 years we're not going to see such discoloration that it's going to create a blight in the community.
And usually, I mean, now I'm getting off topic. No, but you can make agreements with artists saying, you agree to come back within the next 5 years and do touch-ups for such, either for free or for such and such pay. So there's workarounds, but not our issue.
Is there any other questions or discussions that you guys would like to have? Recommendations, point of facts?
I just have one, just for administrative side, this is a long, lengthy process. Until we change this, the process is going to continue as it was. So unless we put a moratorium on COAs for these things or anything like that, then it will continue as the process has been before.
So with that said, Joni, how much longer would you need to do your research so we could reconvene?
2 weeks. And that will give time for public comment, and I can get us the research done and have examples for you all to look at in 2 weeks. I think that should give ample time for public comment at that particular point. But then it does have to go through all of the public hearings and all of the processes. We have been advised that we should not look at content, period, from now on. So if a mural comes in front of this board as it is, we would follow all the other guidelines that are set in place other than design and content. Now, I'm not sure how that needs to work as a process, if we just simply say we don't look at it.
Right now, I mean, you're prohibited from looking at it. So in the event the statute or our rules and regulations have been superseded by that decision,
Correct.
Therefore the process would still be the same, but upon a direction of staff at any DHB meeting, we would inform them that they cannot review content and can only look at the other regulations that are in place.
So since we're all together, and 2 weeks from now would be March the 17th, is that a workable day for the board, commissioners, staff, or would you prefer another day?
I'm good then. I'm good.
We all have to wear green.
Through that?
Yes, it is, St. Patty's Day.
Staff, does that meet? Does that work?
Yes, we have no issue on that day, looking at everything.
9:30?
I can do it as early as 10 that day, but I'm booked until then. But y'all can proceed without me if you like.
Well, why don't we do 10, since we should not have near as much to discuss. 10 o'clock?
10 a.m. And we'll publish until, say, noon. And same thing, joint meeting.
Yes,
Madam
sir.
Clerk, will you facilitate that?
Julie Wagner that day. Thanks.
And
Biscuits and gravy.
before
We may have an action item on that day, just so we can take action if necessary by both boards. Not as an approval, like a first reading or anything of that nature, but just an affirmative vote to approve a recommendation for further consideration. So let's make sure, Madam Clerk, that we have that action item. Action may be taken if necessary upon a recommendation. And the only last comment I'd like to make today is I think what we've talked a lot about today, what makes Danville unique and things of this situation. What we're doing here today is policy making 101. You have vested stakeholders involved, elected officials, qualified individuals in the community who care about this topic. A venue has been granted to provide access to the discussion. It's up front, and that's how you have successful policy making, when you have the stakeholders combined to discuss. Staff will take that and develop a document. We've outlined a process where the public will be given ample time for feedback. And when you operate in a manner that's as transparent and open as that, you have buy-in to whatever is decided, whether you agree with every term and condition or not. So kudos to staff for participation in this event, for hosting it, and the framework of what we decide is critical to the community accepting it. So I applaud you for that.
And when will this video of this meeting be up?
Usually a couple days.
Couple days.
Yes, and please, my email is jhouse@danvilleky.gov. You can send your written statements to me, your recommendations, please do. You can drop them off at Codes Enforcement. I will pick them up and happily look over them. You can call me. I would prefer not to give it out in the newspaper. So it's my cell phone. But if you stop by Codes Enforcement office, they can provide you with that. So I'm happy to talk, meet, whatever we need to get this worked out.
And
I'm
we'll
happy
put
to
that
do.
on social media and our other
Certainly.
avenues to
Mhm.
let, asking for public comment as well.
Yes.
Anything else? To hear a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
We have a motion, is there a second?
Second.
We have a second. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Thank you all. We are adjourned.